Educational GMAT. Your partner in your GMAT journey.
Let's start by doing a question here. Again, who is the author of this argument? Economist. All right. What do you guys think is the main conclusion of the argument?
That this line that this practice may hurt more farmers in developing nation than it
Very
helps.
nice. Very nice. Right. That's the main conclusion. Okay. Let's also understand the argument. Now, what's happening is that tell me, fair trade coffee, is that more expensive or non-fair trade coffee is more expensive? Obviously, people pay extra for fair trade coffee. So clearly, fair trade coffee is more expensive, right? Uh, but then why are people willing to pay extra for fair trade coffee? Because the intent is to help poor farmers, right? Okay. Now, the argument, however, says, notice it's clearly given that they means farmers receive a higher price for fair trade coffee, right? So fair trade coffee is more expensive. The argument then says that this practice as in the fair trade coffee, it may hurt more farmers in developing nations than it helps. And then the argument says by raising average prices. Okay, all right. Now this is, let's say, fair trade coffee, and this is non-fair trade coffee. So clearly the price of fair trade coffee is high. The price for non-fair trade coffee is lower. Since the fair trade coffee is priced higher, right? So then what will happen, friends? What will happen? That average price of coffee, let us say, would be this, right? Somewhere between fair trade and non-fair trade. Since the average price is high for coffee, right? Since the average price is high, what happens? What is here? By raising the average price for coffee, right? This is fair trade, this is non-fair trade, right? So the average would be somewhere in between. By raising the average price for coffee, it encourages more coffee to be produced than consumers want to buy. So which means because farmers look at the higher average price, more and more number of farmers would be tempted to start growing coffee, right? But then notice fair trade price is fixed, right? It's high. Since more coffee is produced, then what happens, guys? The price of non-fair trade coffee comes even further lower. And that's the reason it's saying that this practice may hurt more farmers than it helps. Right? Again, just summarizing the discussion, because fair trade coffee is quite costly, and people are willing to. Why are people willing to pay that price? Because the intent is to help poor farmers. However, fixing a high price for fair trade coffee elevates or increases the average price of coffee. Since average price is high, more and more number of farmers are inspired or encouraged to produce coffee. But then as coffee production is more, which means the supply of coffee is more, but this is fixed, which means the price of non-fair trade coffee further falls down. This lowers prices, notice this lowers prices for non-fair trade coffee and thus lowers profits for non-fair trade coffee farmers. Okay, all right. Now, first of all, tell me this entire practice of fair trade, uh, this practice is helping whom? This category or this category? This practice.
Fair trade, fair
Obviously
trade coffee
helping,
growers.
yes, all obviously helping fair trade and hurting non-fair trade. Agreed? So this entire practice of fair trade, this entire practice, so let me put it this way, this practice is obviously helping fair trade farmers and hurting non-fair trade farmers. I'm already dropping you guys a hint. All right. Keep the conclusion in mind.
Beta.
All right. Very, very nice. So basically, what is evaluate the argument all about? It's basically saying that before we conclude this, right? This is the conclusion, correct? Evaluate the argument. Evaluate means what? To judge or form an opinion, right? This is the opinion of the argument. But to form this opinion, before we form this opinion, what should we know? What else should we know before we form this opinion? Now notice, why is alpha incorrect? Why is alpha incorrect? Because it has already accepted this opinion and then is saying that given that this happens, what do we do to alleviate its impact? The point about evaluating the argument is, however, that we don't even accept this opinion. We are saying that before we accept this opinion, what else should we know? In other words, what additional information would help us either strengthen this conclusion or weaken it? All right. Now, tell me what was the conclusion itself? This practice may clearly, this practice, as in paying extra for fair trade coffee, this is clearly, I think we have all established that it is helping fair trade farmers and it is hurting non-fair trade farmers. Okay. Now tell me, let us say, let us say in the, in whichever country is we are being or whatever is country is being talked about, let us say 60% of farmers are in fair trade coffee and 40% are non-fair trade, let's say. All right. Now, that being the case, tell me this practice, is it helping more farmers or hurting more farmers?
Helping more farmers.
Helping more farmers, right? Because in this country, 60% farmers are fair trade and 40% are non-fair trade. And we've already established that this practice is helping fair trade farmers, right? So if this is the scenario, then notice what is happening to this conclusion. This scenario is weakening the conclusion. Do you agree? Because the conclusion is saying that this practice is hurting more farmers. While if this is what the statistics look like, then this is helping more farmers. On the other hand, let us say only 25% of the farmers in this country are fair trade and 75% are non-fair trade. If this is the case, then tell me, is this practice helping more farmers or hurting more farmers?
Helping.
Notice, remember, this practice is helping fair trade, right?
Sorry,
So
hurting. Sorry.
yeah, so if this is the scenario, then this practice is helping 25% of the farmers and hurting 75%, right? And that's exactly what the argument also concludes. So which means if this is the case, then it strengthens the argument, right? So in other words, before we conclude that this practice, what practice? Paying extra for fair trade coffee. Before we conclude that this practice is hurting more farmers, we have to figure out what proportion of the total farmers are engaged in fair trade coffee. And that's exactly what Baker says. Because if this is the proportion, then the conclusion is weakened. If this is the proportion, then the conclusion is strengthened. I'll go back. Notice, what did we do for Baker? We provided mutually opposite extreme answers uh, to Baker, right? In one case, we said most farmers are fair trade. In the other case, we stated that most farmers are non-fair trade, right? So we provided opposite answers to Baker. And then providing these mutually opposite extreme answers, what did it do? It produced two mutually opposite conclusions. Notice in first case it is weakening, in the second case it is strengthening. Notice whether these farmers also derive income from other kinds of farming. What does other kind of farming mean? Perhaps apart from coffee, are they growing something else also? Well, that's out of scope, right? The scope here is whether paying extra for fair trade coffee, is it helping more farmers or hurting more farmers? Or whether consumers should pay extra for fair trade coffee at all? Well, that's not the question, right? They are paying extra. How fair trade coffee farmers in developing nations could be helped without lowering profits? Again, why is Edward incorrect? Because it already accepts this conclusion and then says, given that this is happening, what next should we do? But evaluate the argument is actually is about questioning the conclusion itself. That before we accept this as a conclusion, we need to know whether this is the case or this is the case, because each of these produces mutually opposite conclusions.